The wind was a blade against Anya's skin, sharpened on the jagged peaks of the unforgiving mountains. It tore through the threadbare wool of her coat, a cruel mockery of protection against the biting, relentless snow that fell not in flakes, but in a solid, blinding curtain of white. Each breath was an agony of ice in her lungs. Behind her, 5 shadows stumbled, their shapes blurred by the blizzard, their groans lost to the howl of the storm. There was old Elspeth and her husband Gregor, their faces gray with a cold that had sunk deeper than bone. There was young Lena, barely a woman, weeping silently. And there were the children, her own brother and sister, Leo and Marta, their small bodies shivering so violently she feared they might shatter. 6 of them, driven from the valley by whispers that turned to shouts, and shouts that turned to stones. They were outsiders, their accents a brand, their poverty a crime. Now, the wilderness they had fled to was a more honest, if more brutal, executioner. Hope had been the first thing to freeze. It lay somewhere back on the trail, a stiff and useless thing. All that remained was a primal instinct, a desperate animal need to put one foot in front of the other. Anya's world had shrunk to the sight of her own cracked boots sinking into the endless, suffocating snow. This is it, she thought, a quiet, hollow acceptance settling in her core. This is where it ends. Marta whimpered, a sound so thin it was almost carried away by the wind. Anya stopped, turning to gather the small girl into her arms. Marta's face, pressed against her neck, was as cold as a river stone. It was then, through the swirling chaos, that she saw it. A flicker, a smudge of gold against the gray-white fury. Smoke, a wavering tendril, battling the storm, rising from a low-slung shape half-buried in a drift. A cabin. The sight sent a jolt through her, so sharp and fierce it felt like pain. It was a phantom, a cruel trick of a dying mind. But the smell, faint and sharp, followed the scent of pine smoke. It was real. A new energy, born of final desperation, surged through her limbs. She hoisted Marta higher, her voice raw as she shouted to the others. There. Look. She pointed with a hand she could no longer feel. They staggered towards it, a broken procession drawn to a single point of light in a universe of cold. The cabin was small, built of heavy, dark logs chinked with mud, its roof heavy with a thick blanket of snow. A single window glowed with the warm, unsteady light of a lamp. It looked like a bastion against the end of the world, solid and defiant. Could be salvation. It could also be a different kind of danger. Men who chose to live this far from the world were not always kind to it. But the alternative was certain death, a frozen tableau for the spring thaw to find. Anya set Marta down, her small legs buckling. She pushed the others behind her, placing herself between them and the heavy plank door. Her heart hammered a frantic, painful rhythm against her ribs. She raised a fist, the knuckles numb and clumsy, and knocked. The sound was swallowed by the storm. She knocked again, harder, putting the last of her strength into the blows. For a long moment, there was nothing but the screaming wind. Then the light inside shifted. A heavy bolt scraped from within, a sound that echoed the grating of rock on rock. The door opened a crack. A wall of warmth, thick with the scent of wood smoke, roasted meat, and something wild and musky, washed over her. In the gap stood a man. He was tall, broad in the shoulder, his face a landscape of shadows and sharp angles carved by the lamplight. A thick, dark beard covered the lower half of his face, and his eyes, deep-set and piercing, held no welcome. They held nothing at all. They were as barren as the winter peaks. He looked at Anya, his gaze sweeping over the huddled, wretched group behind her. His expression did not change. Despair clawed at her throat. "Please," she whispered, the word brittle, fragile. "The children. We will die out here," he said nothing. He simply looked at them, his silence a judgment more profound than any shout. Anya could feel the hope that had flared so briefly guttering out, leaving only the cold, familiar dark. She had led them to a door that would not open, to a heart as frozen as the land itself. The trapper's silence stretched, each moment a new layer of ice forming over Anya's heart. He was a creature of this place, she realized. Hardened, isolated, weathered into something not quite human. His gaze was not cruel but assessing, the way a man might assess a broken tool or a lame animal, weighing its worth against the trouble it would bring. He looked past her at little Marta, whose shivering had subsided into a limp lethargy, her head lolling against Lena's leg. He saw Gregor, leaning heavily on his wife, his breath coming in ragged, shallow puffs. Something flickered in those deep, unreadable eyes. A shadow of a memory, perhaps, or a simple acknowledgement of the finality of their situation. Without a word, he pulled the heavy door inward. He did not step aside to welcome them, but simply created a space for them to enter, an offering made with the barest minimum of motion. Anya did not need a second invitation. She pushed Lena and the children forward, then helped Elspeth guide Gregor over the threshold. The warmth inside was a physical shock, so profound it made her dizzy. The single room was small, dominated by a stone hearth where a fire blazed, casting dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls. Furs and drying herbs hung from the rafters, and the air was thick with the scent of a life lived in solitude. The man, the trapper, closed the door, shutting out the storm's fury with a heavy thud that sealed them in. He moved with a quiet, deliberate economy, wasting no energy. He pointed a large, calloused hand toward the fire. There the word was rough, as if dredged up from a deep well of disuse. It was not a welcome but a command. They obeyed, huddling together on the floor near the hearth, soaking in the life-giving heat. They were a strange, broken flock in this wild man's den, and the silence was thick with unspoken questions and fear. Anya watched him. He moved to the fire, taking a pot of simmering stew from its hook. He ladled the thick, meaty broth into 6 tin bowls with a steady hand, his movements efficient and certain. He set them on the floor before them, along with a loaf of dark, heavy bread. He did not speak, did not meet their eyes. He simply provided. Anya took a bowl, her hands shaking as she passed it to Marta. The first spoonful was a revelation, a warmth that spread from her stomach through her entire being, chasing away the deep, internal chill. It was a taste of life itself. As they ate, a fragile quiet settled over the room, punctuated only by the crackle of the fire and the sound of spoons against tin. Anya studied their reluctant host. He was a man built of stillness, his presence as solid and unyielding as the mountains outside. Scars mapped the backs of his hands, and one traced a thin, white line from his temple into his beard. He had taken a seat on a low stool in the corner, away from them, and was mending a leather strap with a needle and sinew, his focus absolute. He seemed to exist in a world of his own making, a world that had been violently breached. Yet he had let them in. He had given them food and fire. These were actions, not words, and in this harsh place, actions were the only currency that mattered. Days bled into one another, marked not by the sun, which remained hidden behind a persistent veil of gray cloud, but by the trapper's routines. He would rise before dawn, check his traps, and return with game, his face impassive. He shared his food, his fire, his shelter, but never his thoughts. They learned his name was Silas only because Elspeth, with the gentle audacity of the old, had asked him directly. He had grunted the name and turned away. Anya found herself in a state of constant observation, learning the man through his habits. The way he banked the fire at night to conserve wood. The precise way he sharpened his knives. The moments he would stand at the small window, staring out at the snow, his posture rigid, his hands clenched into fists. He was a fortress, and she could not see the man inside the walls. She and the others did what they could to earn their keep. Anya took over the cooking, stretching the rations with what little knowledge she had. Lena mended their tattered clothes. Even the children helped, stacking firewood by the hearth. They tried to make their intrusion as small as possible. One evening, Anya saw Leo watching Silas stitch a tear in a fur pelt. The boy, usually so timid, crept closer, his eyes wide with fascination. Anya held her breath, ready to pull him back, But Silas didn't move. After a long moment, he held out a small, smoothed piece of wood and a blunted whittling knife. He didn't speak, just nudged them toward the boy. Leo took them, his small hands clumsy, and sat near the hearth, mimicking the man's focused silence. It was a gesture of profound, unspoken trust, a bridge built across a chasm of solitude. In that quiet moment, watching the large, scarred man and the small, hopeful boy work in silent companionship, Anya felt the first, tentative thaw of her own fear. This man was not just a fortress, he was a sanctuary. The fragile peace of their sanctuary was shattered by a sound that did not belong in the heart of the wilderness. The sharp, angry bark of a dog, followed by the crunch of heavy boots on crusted snow. Anya froze, the wooden spoon she was using to stir the morning porridge clattering to the floor. Silas was instantly on his feet, his body taut, his head cocked toward the door. His face, usually a mask of stoic indifference, was now sharp with a dangerous alertness. He moved to the window, peering through a small gap in the hide covering. A muscle tightened in his jaw. "Stay away from the window," he commanded, his voice a low growl. The order was unnecessary. Fear had already sent them scrambling to the far corner of the cabin. The children huddled behind Anya. The knocking on the door was not a plea for help, but an arrogant, impatient summons. "Silas, we know you're in there, and we know who you're hiding." The voice was slick with a confidence that grated on Anya's nerves. It was Thorn, the man from the valley, the one whose greed had fueled the town's hatred, who saw their small, migrant community not as people, but as cheap labor to be exploited or discarded. She had seen his face in her nightmares. Silas turned from the window, his eyes meeting Anya's. For the first time, she saw something other than stoicism in their depths. It was a cold, settled rage, like the deep ice of a frozen lake. He picked up his heavy trapping axe, its weight seeming a natural extension of his arm. He didn't look frightened. He looked weary, as if this were an old, unwanted argument he was being forced to have again. "He won't find purchase here," Silas said, the words a vow. He unbolted the door and opened it, not wide, but enough to block the entrance with his own formidable frame. 3 men stood there, Thorn in the lead, flanked by 2 rough-looking men from the town. Thorn's face was ruddy from the cold and self-satisfaction. He smirked when he saw Silas. "Still playing hermit, Silas? I heard you'd taken in some strays. Company property. I'm afraid. They absconded. I'm here to collect." His eyes flicked past Silas, trying to see into the cabin's dim interior. He saw Anya, and his smirk widened. "There you are, my dear. Your little adventure is over. Come along now." Anya felt a tremor of her old fear, the familiar instinct to shrink away, to become invisible. But then she looked at Silas, standing like a bulwark between her and the world that had tried to break her. He had not questioned their story. He had not asked for payment. He had simply shared what he had. His quiet resilience had seeped into her, reinforcing her own. She got to her feet, her spine straight, her chin high. She would not cower in the corner this time. "We are not your property," she said, her voice clear and steady, ringing with a strength she didn't know she possessed. Thorn's face darkened. "Don't be foolish, girl. You have nothing. You are nothing. Now get out here before we drag you out." Silas shifted his weight, the head of his axe catching the pale morning light. "They are under my protection," he said, his voice flat and final. "This is my land. You are not welcome here." Thorn laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Your land? This all belongs to the company now, Silas. You're just squatting, same as them. We have papers." "Your papers mean nothing to the mountain," Silas replied, his gaze unwavering. "And they mean nothing to me." "Leave." One of Thorn's men, emboldened by their numbers, took a step forward, his hand reaching for the pistol tucked in his belt. "Maybe we should teach this animal some manners." In a movement too fast to follow, Silas swung the butt of his axe, not the blade, in a short, brutal arc, connected with the man's wrist with a sickening crack. The man screamed, staggering back, clutching his arm. The second man froze, his eyes wide. Thorn's arrogant expression evaporated, replaced by a flicker of genuine fear. He looked at Silas, truly seeing him for the first time, not as a reclusive eccentric, but as a dangerous and unpredictable force of nature, as much a part of this wild land as the blizzards and the bears. "This isn't over," Thorn spat, his voice trembling slightly. He began to back away, pulling his injured man with him. Silas watched them go, his stance unchanged until their retreating figures were swallowed by the trees. He stood for a long moment, staring into the woods, before closing the door and bolting it. The silence that fell was profound. He leaned the axe against the wall and turned, his gaze finding Anya. The fury was gone, replaced by that familiar, deep stillness. But this time, she understood it was not emptiness. It was a containment of things too powerful to let loose. He had not fought for property or principle. He had fought for them. The immediate aftermath of the confrontation was a heavy, humming silence. The echo of Thorn's threats and the sharp crack of bone seemed to linger in the air, a stain on the cabin's quiet sanctity. Anya watched as Silas moved to the hearth and methodically added a log to the fire, his hands steady, his movements as deliberate as ever. He was banking the flames of his own rage, just as he banked the embers each night. The fortress was intact, its walls proven unbreachable. He had not done it for honor or for law, but for a reason more fundamental, something rooted in the harsh soil of this place. He had defended his own small, chosen world. She walked towards him, her footsteps soft on the wooden floorboards. The children were still quiet in the corner, awed and frightened by the violence they had witnessed, but seeing that Silas was calm, they began to relax. Anya stopped a few feet from him, waiting until he looked up from the fire. His eyes met hers, and the familiar wall of reserve was still there, but she could see cracks in it now, fissures that let a different light through. "They will be back," she said. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, a shared acknowledgement of a future that remained perilous. "Perhaps," Silas replied, his voice low. He straightened up, turning to face her fully. "But the mountain is a difficult place for men like that. It has its own laws. They will find this is not the valley." There was a finality in his tone that offered a strange comfort. He was not promising an easy life, but a defensible one. For the first time, she felt the weight of her long flight begin to lift, not gone, but shifted, as if he were now helping her carry it. She thought of the woman who had arrived at this door weeks ago, a ghost hollowed out by fear and cold. She had been begging for survival. Now, standing in the warm, firelit cabin, she felt a different kind of strength taking root inside her. It was a quiet, hardy thing, like the resilient pines that clung to the mountainside. She had survived not just the storm, but the men who had created it. She had found her voice and stood her ground, not behind Silas, but beside him. In his solitude, she had discovered her own resilience. "Why?" she asked, the single word holding all her unspoken questions. "Why us? Why risk yourself for strangers?" Silas looked away from her, his gaze drifting to the small window, toward the vast, indifferent wilderness outside. He was silent for so long she thought he would not answer. "This mountain takes enough," he said at last, his voice rough with an old, deep sorrow. No need to help it along in that simple, stark admission. She glimpsed the man inside the fortress. A man who had known profound loss, who had retreated from the world of men not out of hatred, but out of a pain too great to bear. He protected them because he understood, in a way no one else could, what it felt like to be at the mercy of a cruel and arbitrary world. He was not just their savior. He was their kin in spirit, another soul marked by the wilderness, both within and without. A new, unspoken pact was forged in that quiet moment. Their shared future was an unmapped territory, fraught with hardship, but it was no longer a landscape of despair. Hope was no longer a desperate flicker, but a slow, steady ember, tended by two solitary people who had found an unlikely refuge in each other. The fire in the hearth crackled, and outside, the wind whispered through the pines, a sound that no longer seemed like a threat, but a lullaby. They were not just 6 refugees and a trapper anymore. They were a strange, resilient family, sheltered by the high, lonely mountains and the quiet strength of a man who had forgotten he was not alone.